So Jeff, I've been a part of probably close to 100 implementations in my career, and I'd like to say that 99 of them have gone well. Now, the one that didn't, I have some thoughts on maybe how it didn't or why it didn't. What's been your experience? You've been through a handful of these, and from the controller or CFO side, what was your perspective on who's ultimately responsible for the success of an ERP implementation? Is it the client or is it the implementation company, the partner? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think even in my own space, I think there's a level of acknowledgement that the customer, is ultimately responsible for making sure that this stays on track, or that a lot of the criteria are being met. Obviously, as the consultant, we're trying to set up the timeline and set up the testing to make sure that to show out to the customer that we've met all their requirements. But as the controller, I was always, and I think controllers, CFOs typically are a little bit more kind of check themselves with they're a little bit controlling in the sense, not to say that they're micromanaging or demanding, but at the same time, they want to see things for themselves. So they typically want to be involved and see some of that testing and make sure that the testing and understand what the deadlines are. Certainly the consulting team can help lay out when those should be, setting the checkpoints. I think that's certainly one of the keys. Don't just kind of start it and say 2 months later we expect to go live, that you're building in checkpoints. But then on the customer side, making sure you're working with your team to say, am I responsible for all these elements? Am I passing any of this off to my director or my accounting manager or whomever to say, I want you to be responsible for each of these components, and then ultimately working with your other departments, whether it's your head of customer service, your head of sales, to make sure that they are feeding data through your CRM application if you're trying to tie that in. Obviously, your IT team is going to be key, making sure that you've got someone within that department that's either taking a key role or perhaps even leading it itself. I think I've seen that and have been a partner where really the IT team was leading some of this, understanding what are some of the requirements, what are the keys with regards to security, what are their applications. You touched on the simple idea that you're making one change, making sure the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. You're making one change, and they already, another department already had plans to start another initiative to move to perhaps a cloud-based application or networking, or they may have a lot of other projects that they were in the process of talking through, and making sure that you're coordinating with them to say what are the key requirements or what sort of changes may be on the horizon that may affect this project. And then, as I also touched on before, making sure that everyone has the bandwidth to do all these things. If you're trying to do an ERP implementation right at year end, when you're trying to do the close, or right near audit time when everyone's trying to do their daily work plus do all these other things,
right.
And that you have the right skill sets, that your people that have kind of worked with your systems, do they pick it up pretty quickly, or are they experts in that system because they've done it for a great deal of time, understanding kind of managing that change process? Do you feel like they're going to be able to pick up the change to the new system? Are they going to be a little bit change resistant? And then trying to manage through that whole process to say,
right.
Are you going to have someone that's been doing accounts payable, that's been doing it for 20 years, 30 years, and doesn't really like change? Spending a little bit extra time talking with them, assuring them why this is going to be a good thing, how this is actually going to ultimately help them, even if it may be a little bit of a pain point in the near term. And then just kind of making sure that you're kind of making sure to identify each of the responsible parties that makes, that you're not have one person doing it all, and then trying to communicate all that back and have a lot of interaction with your consulting team, because yes, your consulting team are the experts. They're the ones that are going to help facilitate this, but your team is going to have a lot of involvement. Now, certainly we can, employ the consultant to do a lot of this stuff, they can probably do it a little bit easier than your team, but your team is going to have the expertise, have the knowledge, and it will probably aid them as far as understanding and seeing the system along during the process as well.
Right.
So as far as in your hundreds of implementations, maybe you can kind of elaborate on some of the scenarios where either the customer did not manage this well or put too much onto the consultant, or really kind of just took over and ran without really seeking your expertise.
Right. Yeah. I have seen a lot, and one thing to I want to mention first is that your ERP partner is there to guide you through the process for selection of an ERP system, and also in the implementation process. Part of our job is to make sure that there are qualified people on the client team to go through the process. What are the skill sets that we're working with, but also to figure out who is ultimately responsible. In my perspective, because the client is the one paying for this, and who ultimately has to do the reporting, either to upper management or, in case of a public company, to the world, if you will. So ultimately, the CFO or the controller, in my opinion, is responsible. IT is involved, as you alluded to, as far as platform concerns are going, other initiatives within the company. They're going to know maybe more about that sometimes than the accounting department, but also security reasons. Is our systems going to be secure? So that's where IT comes in. But ultimately, again, it's the finance team that I think is responsible. They have to be able to capture the information that they need for reporting, that they need for internal and again external reporting. This usually falls on the controller or the CFO. In a larger implementation, you may have several people that are your project leaders. If it's a larger organization, AP is going to play a big role, and we touched on that. It's important that we gain efficiencies there, because it does take a lot of time to process and get everybody paid. So if you don't have an executive sponsor in the company, whether it be CFO or even CEO, who is promoting the success of a project such as the ERP implementation, it could be destined to fail. So it's important, from our perspective, that we know that we have executive sponsorship, and also that we have a champion of the system that we suggest. Somebody who says, yes, Intact is the best, or NetSuite is the best, or Business Central is the best. This is the product we selected. It's the product that we're going to make work, and it's going to be the best for our company to go forward.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's also and I kind of talked about the change resistant person. I think sometimes,
right,
as you're going through that process of selecting a new system, I think you sometimes will get, because there's probably not one system that's perfect for all aspects. There's probably one system is a little bit better here, a little bit better there, so on and so forth. And then trying to get that champion that can work with perhaps the individual who's responsible for the component that they felt like this other system worked a little bit better, but overall, you're trying to go with one other, with perhaps the system that they don't choose, and then trying to similarly get them on board to make sure that they understand that we're going to help, we're going to work to meet your needs, but fundamentally we're going with the system that kind of checks a few more boxes, as it were.
Right. Yep. And I think you're right. There always is that one person who's a little bit more reticent to make change. And we see that almost in every situation, but they also sometimes become the biggest champion for the product once they see what it can do and how it makes their life better. I can think of one recently that we had where it was a smaller customer, and they did not have the resources to have a team, if you will. So they leaned very heavily on our expertise and even in our accounting knowledge. And we take pride that most of our implementation teams are former accountants or even current CPAs. So we do have that expertise when needed. But there are times when the client just doesn't have the bandwidth or the team to make an implementation successful, and they lean heavily on us. So we kind of tag team on who's responsible, but ultimately, again, I think it is the client that has to guarantee that success.
Yeah, and I think I've seen too within organizations, we kind of touched on talking a lot of these different departments, and it usually a lot of your kind of, your non-finance or non-IT departments are usually very much happy to kind of work with us to say, I don't have to send you an Excel file. I don't have to build this information out for you to be able to key this in. I don't have to, generate a lot of reports to bring to our management meetings and so on and so forth, that it's all right there, and then executives can see it. But often within, you may have to kind of work with them to say, during this implementation, I need support. I'm going to need a little bit of help. I'm going to need a little guidance here as we set up these things. But kind of getting that champion to say, long term, it's going to provide benefits. I think one of the biggest challenges is typically between the finance and IT group. A lot of times, your senior management are experienced and successful, and they're used to typically leading projects within their department and being responsible and being in charge. And I feel like those are the two departments that you can sometimes get the most conflict with regards to who's really in charge. I think a lot of times, particularly IT, they really take ownership of everything that's within their environment, especially as you kind of touched on the security aspects, that they want to understand any piece of software that's going to be installed or utilized within the department. Certainly, obviously, a lot of things are moving to the cloud-based that may or may not really be, so to speak, within their your network, but managing who has access to these, what data is being captured, what is the security and encryption level for all the data elements. They'll take a very hands-on approach, and at the same time really want to kind of take control of a few things. So as you mentioned, I think certainly these are financial oriented packages and data reporting and processing that, generally your controller, your CFO needs to take the lead role or be able to dictate what is necessary. But certainly your IT team, and I've seen it where, your IT team is, has certain requirements and demands that you need to follow. And when then they're not, so to speak, making the decisions, or if their team, similarly, as we said, is working on other projects, that they may not be as kind of timely with regards to try and help things out, or if you're making a decision that doesn't really align with their initial recommendations, that it can be a bit of a challenge. And then sometimes to try and get them on board, or to make sure that they're kind of taking care of their responsibilities, really does require that champion from an executive level, such that you do have your CFO, your controller, that says, this is really what we need. I understand that you have your expectations and your requirements, and we're going to accommodate all of those, but we really need our team to really be managing this from a timeline and expectations.
I was just going to say, overall, it's been real good that we haven't had anybody refuse to take ownership or responsibility, but just sometimes too many people do, or there's a turf war between IT and finance.
And I think a lot of that tends to center around access. Who needs to see this? What are they processing? What are you trying to install, and or who has the responsibility in the timeline, and who's kind of, I don't know, just setting the expectation, setting the process, and really who's the point person. I think sometimes you run into scenarios where, if by simple fact of that the consulting team is communicating more with the CFO or the controller, and is not directly involving the IT department, then they tend to feel like they're not, that their requirements or their needs are not being addressed or not being factored in or considered as much. When that's certainly not the case, but yeah, the short answer is I feel like I've seen where some IT folks tend to give less priority as far as helping serve the ERP implementation when they don't feel like they're in charge. When they don't tend to like to take direction as much. And I think accountants are equally, I think everybody, as I mentioned, you get your senior staff, your senior executive team, they're accustomed to being in charge for things that affect their department. And nobody really likes to be told what to do once you've achieved that level of role and responsibility. And because the IT team and the accounting or the finance team are so involved in this process that you do have to involve your IT team. That's inevitably the department that you're really kind of depending on and affecting the most. And like I said, if you're simply trying to dictate things, or if they're simply not in charge, I feel like that's really kind of the biggest element where you need to get buy-in and need to get acceptance. Because again, if you're trying to tell them what to do when they're not leading the project, it's just not, as you mentioned, the vast majority of the implementations and the vast majority of the ones that I've gone through have gone off without a hitch, and they're happy to, they see what comes down and how all the different improvements are going to be achieved, so they're on board. It's the exception, maybe the one kind of support staff or the one kind of person that's being told to load into this or set up permissions for that, or to allow this to come through, or even to the idea of allowing an outside party to have access to our systems, that they kind of get their feathers ruffled a little bit and are not quite as happy to participate or to allow things or to do things a little bit timely. But certainly it's been the overwhelming majority of them identify the opportunities and how things are going to be improved through this whole process and are on board. It's definitely the exception to the rule when you have conflict like this, but it's certainly something that you mentioned the champion needs to be ahead of and needs to be able to address.
All right, well, Jeff, thank you. This has been a great conversation, and hopefully this is helpful to those who are planning an implementation or ERP selection process. And again, hope this is helpful information for you.
Absolutely, yeah. Certainly, hopefully they can kind of pull from all of our years of experience.